Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Really excited today to talk about communication, to talk about instructional communication in particular. And to do so, I'm joined today by Michael Strawser, who is an associate professor of communication at the University of Central Florida. Michael, welcome to Trending in Education.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. It's an interesting space. I do follow communication more closely, having done so many of these podcasts, among other things. We always start by getting to know our guests a little bit better. Can you catch our listeners up on what got you to this point in your professional life?
Yeah, so big picture, I've been at UCF since 2019. So before that, and you got to think, in terms of the context of higher ed, UCF is either the second or third largest university in the country, depending on the year. So it's
Mhm.
pretty massive. But my family and I moved down here in 2019. I came from a very small liberal arts private university in Louisville, so like 3,200 students. So it was
Oh,
a it
wow.
was culture shock when we moved down. But yeah, did my PhD at the University of Kentucky in instructional communication. I know we're going to flesh that out a little bit, but personal note, I've got 5 kiddos. My oldest is 9. So
Wow. Wow.
ain't nobody sleeping in my house.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for your service, keeping them under control as best you can. You have to at least go minivan, right? When you get that many.
Yeah, we have to go minivan. We have friends who actually are expecting their 7th.
Wow.
And yeah, speaking of thank you for your service, and they are having like a custom transit van built.
Right.
And whew,
By the time you go 7, it's almost full-on reality television at that point, although I imagine it gets pretty, chaotic and entertaining with your 5. That's probably another episode. That's like an entirely different
probably is.
angle, but at the same time, communication has gotta be key, and parenting, it's certainly key when it comes to education. You mentioned instructional communication, which is intriguing to me. Can you catch folks up on what is instructional communication and what's the problem space that it's focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best statement to describe it in terms of baseline is instructional communication researchers look at communication in instruction. So literally any instructional context, like how does communication manifest? And it can be, in terms of bringing it close to home, like it can be as simple as looking at communication in our college courses as faculty members.
Mhm.
So how does communication either, positively impact or influence learning versus how does it kind of negatively impact learning?
Mhm.
Or even bigger picture, like I live in Florida, so we have hurricanes all the time, but an instructional message could be, "Hey, you got to evacuate. There's a hurricane coming." And I was thinking about it this morning, just as I was thinking about our conversation. And we moved down, and I mentioned this, we moved down in 2019, and the fall of 2019, I think it was Hurricane Irene. I need to go back
Mhm.
and double check that, but
Mhm.
we had never really known anything about hurricanes. And we moved down here from Kentucky. And I'm talking, Mike, it was weeks before this hurricane. The media is telling me it's the apocalypse. Like Florida's going
Yeah.
to be underwater. We're going to separate from Georgia. We're going to be an island, 49 states, get ready. The day that the hurricane was supposed to hit, my family and I were at Disney World. And the only people who were in line for rides were locals. All the tourists stayed home because they were scared of the hurricane. 80, sunny, beautiful, right?
Mm, mm.
Nobody evacuates the state that lives here. Fast forward that to fall of 2022, last year with Ian, that literally decimates the entire west coast of Florida.
Right.
We're getting the same instructional messages like, hey, you
Right.
got to
Right.
evacuate. Here's what you need to do. Here are the behaviors you need to follow. What happens? Nobody listens.
Mhm.
Why? Because we're numb to all of these different realities in terms of the messages that we hear that
Yeah.
hopefully lead to behavior change.
Mhm.
So in essence, that's probably one of the best kind of examples I can give. An instructional communication researcher goes, as we think about the messages that we're sending and how we're sending messages that are instructive in nature,
Mhm.
how are we doing so in a way that is effective and
Mhm.
actually gets people to do something different?
That's interesting. Yeah, and it's gotta be particularly interesting thinking about instruction over that span of time you're talking about, 2019 until now.
Yeah.
There was the great migration to
Yeah.
Zoom and the Trail of Tears back to the classroom.
That's
Now there's
right. Good way to put
hybrid
it.
classes
Yep.
everywhere, not to mention the really complex media landscape that we're all inundated with all the time. I imagine all those things intersect with thinking about instructional communication. Can you kind of set the context around like what it's been like doing your job over the crazy span of the last 5 years?
Yeah, it's funny. I equate going back to my 5 kids. I tell people when they ask me like, "Well, what's it like having 5 kids?" And I say that it's almost like I'm living in this reality where every day is a blended version of the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray
Yeah.
and an episode of ER, where it's like every day is exactly the same, but
Mm.
there's blood and there's broken bones and like everything has this sense of urgency.
Mm.
To a certain extent, honestly, I've kind of felt like that with higher ed for
Yeah.
the last few years, where
Mm.
every day seems the same,
Mhm.
but the sense of urgency is so prevalent
Yeah.
that what used to be a decision that we could take time to think about,
Mm.
just we don't have that luxury anymore. So I think it's important. You mentioned that little tiny kind of global pandemic. It's funny when you think about messages. The CDC now has come out and basically said like, "Hey, we butchered our messaging at the
Right.
beginning of the pandemic," and it
Right.
wasn't even that the messages were wrong. It's just they were contradictory, and
Mhm.
that really forces you to lose credibility pretty quickly with your audience. It's the same thing with higher ed. Like, what messages have we been sending in terms of teaching? And it's funny now that we're on this side of it because, emergency remote teaching is
Yeah.
not what I would consider to be pure online teaching. Like, it was emergency
Yeah.
remote teaching.
Mm.
So it's different. Like, we had to survive. It was survive in advance. And we're now going back and saying, all right, we cannot live by this emergency remote teaching mentality. How do we get back to good pedagogy? How do we get back to good, rapport building and relationship building with our students
Yeah.
while recognizing that they want flexibility and autonomy? It's a really interesting time for higher ed, honestly, that started, in my opinion, in 2008 with the recession. Like that's really where we started to see some trends really pick up. And the pandemic just exacerbated a lot of things that I think were felt realities the decade before. And now we're trying to come back and go, "Ooh, what
Yeah.
are we like? What does this look like for us?"
Right. It's interesting to think about the combinatorial effects of the pandemic and other things like the exponential, like we already had a social media problem, we already had a
Yeah.
screen time problem pre-pandemic, and then for 3 years kids were forced onto their phones, and now we're trying to reach learners, reach educators in
Right.
the aftermath of all that. It's a really profound responsibility. I imagine it also connects to like centers for teaching and learning
Oh, yeah.
and, professional development and ongoing support of teaching as a practice in higher ed. Can you talk about that? It's got to be, challenging, but also probably really eye opening to be as close to other teachers. A lot of folks in higher ed kind of operate more in isolation, but it seems like by the nature of your work, you're really getting close to the actual practice of teaching in a classroom.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, in terms of, I'm a little bit of I call myself an academic orphan, where I feel like I kind of live in these worlds between communication and education. But then, very practically, as part of what I do, I'm the managing editor of the Journal of Faculty Development and do a lot of kind of faculty training in terms of teaching,
Mhm.
partly because I like it, and honestly, partly selfishly. Like I feel like every time that I engage in those conversations, it's just helpful for me to learn and kind of steal ideas from others. It's a really interesting space because, I think a lot of times with learners, we perpetuate self-fulfilling prophecies. We kind of assume that because our traditional college age students are between the ages of 18 to 22 and are digital natives and all of these different types of things, that they all want to learn a certain way.
Mhm.
And that's just not true. That's just not true. So we kind of approach our classrooms as not pandering is probably too strong of a word, but like we kind of teach to the masses when in reality we've got, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, 250 different individuals that are all sitting there going, you know what, different things are going to resonate. And the end goal is always learning. So, what does it look like in the midst of, this environment that has forced them to Zoom, which in some ways have wonderful realities, like
Right.
it does increase flexibility, it does increase autonomy. I think it increases access. Those are all good things.
Yeah.
Is learning occurring? And, we saw a lot of students in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic even start to sue their universities, like saying, hey, this is not what I signed up for. Yeah, it's still a little bit of the wild, wild west. So I think, you know, good instructional strategy doesn't necessarily change. I just think you have to kind of step back and go, in the midst of this context, in the midst of this audience, what do I need to do to achieve whatever those learning outcomes are for the course or what I'm trying to do.
Right.
So yeah, there are some stalwarts that I think don't disappear. It's just a matter of how those manifest themselves in these different environments.
Right. And then staying on top of not just the instruction, but also the media platforms through which it's being conveyed. This is where I like to quote Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message.
Yeah.
There's so many different media out there that it's hard to even get straight which message I'm trying to send, which should I be on TikTok? Should I be using ChatGPT? It's so overwhelming that I think a lot of people just are shutting down. And
Oh yeah.
it's almost like I think it's called cognitive tunneling, where when you're overwhelmed, you just kind of focus on what you know, keep it
Yeah.
very simple, and just grind, 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 grind. I understand that reaction. I understand those emotions, but it's almost the opposite of what we want a good instructor to do, where that's more being open to feedback, being open to experimentation. How do you think about that medium as the message and just the complexity of all the new stuff that's out there in the world around us? It's got to be both fascinating and kind of overwhelming at the same time.
I think it makes me tired. If McLuhan knew what we have at our fingertips, I think his eyes would bug out of his head. You
Hmm.
know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just the sheer breadth of platforms is
Yep.
it's unreal. It's unreal. Have you seen recent data? I mean, we're starting to see not a severe drop off, but like in terms of people actually posting to
Mm,
social platforms,
mm.
we're starting to see the first decline that we've seen probably in a decade. So,
Interesting.
like we're starting to see people start to, create quote unquote less content and
Mm,
post less.
mm.
And I think we're entering this phase, honestly, where people are just tired. We're just
Yeah.
tired.
Yeah.
And it's funny as we think about teaching in that space and in that context. Like there are some instructors that I think have a tendency to think of ed tech as wizardry and gadgetry. And so it's like whatever the next spell is, we're going to cast it and see what sticks. And man, that's just really bad pedagogy. Like you just have to really think there are so many different tools at your disposal. The tool is not the instruction. The tool is a tool. So
Right.
you mentioned, chat GPT, like I was a relatively, not one of the earliest adopters, but a relatively early adopter to chat GPT. And it saves me a ton of time.
Yeah.
And I use it to supplement a lot of assignments in my courses.
Hmm.
But the reality is it's a tool. It's a tool. And so if all of my instruction focuses on a tool or focuses on what's new,
Hmm.
it's you're just gonna be like a hamster on a wheel, always kind of spinning, 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 trying to figure it out. But it is interesting. I think we are collectively tired. We are
Yes.
bombarded with messages all the time.
Right.
And I think we're starting to see people kind of separate and differentiate from that. And I'm hoping for a collective deep breath, to be honest with you.
And what you're describing, I've heard from quite a few folks too, that it's almost like the right mindset. It's like a growth mindset around technology and some
Yeah.
flexibility where these are tools. I should at least be aware of them and maybe they can help me solve some problems.
Right.
Because the reality is the day to day of grading papers and doing a lot of the more routinized, uploading stuff into a learning management system and just sort of this low value work that is central to higher education. There's a
Yeah.
whole litany of things that are very baked into K-12 that are really low value, not high touch.
Yeah.
Putting all that aside, there ultimately is this concept of instructional communication. And while we have you, I'd love to hear from you some tips or some suggestions, any ways of thinking. You mentioned pedagogy. I've also heard andragogy as something folks have talked about teaching adults and how
Adult. Mhm.
there are some differences, knowing your audience, but anything high level and or specific you think might be useful for our listeners who really span a wide cross section of archetypes within the learning universe. But if you wanted to boil it down to a few tips or ideas, anything jump to mind?
Yeah, I'll nerd out if you'll let me here for just a
Please.
sec,
Yeah.
because in my opinion, instructional communication research is extremely applicable across the spectrum. We are communicating constantly through so many different facets and so many different means and so many different platforms. And, the old stat of like what is it, 95% of what you communication is 95% of what you don't say. Like, who knows? But what I'm telling you is we're communicating constantly. And
Mm,
so as instructors, part of what we have to think about is just how are we doing that effectively? With instructional research, we look at so many different variables. we've got how does an instructor misbehavior influence relationship with students? So how does maybe I self-disclose a little bit too much and
Right.
kind of share some things that you're like, oh,
Right.
well, that's good.
Right.
The flip side is we might have an instructor who discloses too little. And so their student sees them as robotic and sees them as less human because they don't share anything about their personal life. And, they feel like they're kind of closed off. Or even like an instructor use of humor is a communication mechanism. That's communication very, it's funny. I share a lot less jokes in class than I used to because you never know, honestly,
Right.
what one might find offensive. So I just go, okay, I'm just going to make sure that I'm safe in all things in terms of what I'm saying and the
Right.
humor that I'm using. But my students today don't respond to my sarcasm like my students of 10 years ago.
Mhm.
Like now they take that personal, they see that as standoffish. And so
Mm.
that changes how I communicate with my students.
Right.
So I think it's fun underneath this instructional communication umbrella because there are just so many different ways to kind of conceptualize these different instructional realities in terms
Right.
of what message we're sending, which that's the key. It's messages, messages, messages. What message are we sending through what medium? And then how are we sending that message in terms of all of these other peripheries? So you asked about kind of some bigger picture tips. I think that clarity will never go out of vogue. Like it's always going to be important. And the reality is, I think so many students, as they are bombarded with messages on a regular basis. Like even think about, the last time you drove to the grocery store. Like think about how many billboards you passed, how many branded signs you passed.
Mhm.
You are all the time messages, 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 messages. So when we get their brains into this teaching instructional space, like we need to cut through all of the clutter. And just because an assignment description makes sense to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make sense to your students.
Mhm.
So, how can you be exceptionally clear? I started a long time ago thinking about clarity in terms of efficiency. So, what I mean by that is like my goal from a clarity perspective every semester is to diminish the number of emails that I receive from students.
Mhm.
So if I'm being really clear, I shouldn't have that many emails. I know I probably have colleagues with hundreds of emails in their inbox. I got two right now
Mm.
because I'm just sitting there thinking through what are the questions that my students are going to ask me?
Mhm.
How can I preemptively answer their question? And even like on online courses, it's like Pavlov's dog to a certain extent. How are we training them to receive the messages that we send?
Right.
This is very simple, but like if I do a weekly overview video where they know I'm giving them a preview of the week, and if I send that every week at 9, and if I require them to view it, and when they send me an email and say, hey, I have a question about X, Y, and Z, and I say, hey, you know what? I actually addressed that in the course overview video. I need you to go back and watch that. Instead of answering their question via email, it's amazing
Mhm.
how quickly they go, oh, okay, this guy's got his stuff together. He's going to be clear if I let him.
Mm.
We forget a lot of times how much our brains are trying to process. So if we can be simple,
Mm.
I think students resonate with that. Doesn't necessarily mean that learning is increased. That's
Right.
different.
Right.
But it at least means that the students are experiencing the content, I think, in a tangible way and are not overwhelmed. So that's probably the first one is just be as clear as possible
Mhm.
and even have second eyes, look at different things and say, hey, does this make sense? Catalog student comments and responses to what you're doing and go, okay, when I posted this, I got 10 new emails about it. I must not have been clear. How
Right.
do I solve those issues?
Yeah.
That's the first one. The other one, I think, in terms of higher level is that, you know, just because our students like us does not mean that they are learning the content.
Mhm.
However, if our students like us, we have removed a significant barrier in terms of something that makes it harder for them to consume and learn the content. So,
Right.
like,
Right.
what can you do to increase rapport and
Mhm.
relationship? Like
Mhm.
using names, even using names in emails. It takes you 2 extra seconds to write their name back as
Right.
opposed to just writing a one sentence response. Being able to ask follow up questions if they share a personal experience. Like, hey, you doing all right with that? Like, how did that make you feel? You okay? Those are simple things that at the very least remove barriers to learning and can kind of really help differentiate instructors as relationship builders and effective communicators.
I love it. It's also probably relevant for podcasters too. So some of that I'm certainly taking to heart. It does also remind me, I recently read a book by Kevin Roose, who's one of the tech reporters, columnists for the New York Times. It's called Future Proof, and it's 9 rules on how to be sort of resilient and ahead of some of the waves of automation and some of the disruptions that we're anticipating nowadays. And interestingly, teachers were one of the jobs that was out there as being pretty future proof, especially K-12 teachers, where
Yes.
it's going to be a long time before you're starting to put robots into classrooms. And a lot of what teachers do is, and the other thing it's a great book. I really would recommend it to our listeners, recommending to humans that we be surprising, social, and scarce.
That's good.
Which I thought was good, and it made me think about communication, where if my communication is surprising, it's in a social context, and then there is some sense of, like, it's important when you get it, because 'cause we're
Yeah.
there's so much spam and so much low value information out there in the world around us. I'd love to hear a little more from you on, like, from a communication perspective,
Yeah.
how are you thinking about all the stuff that's out there, and it's almost like we have to get better at filtering, finding the signal in the noise,
Yeah.
clearing all of the extraneous stuff out of the way, which is why when you talk clarity,
Yeah.
it rang a few bells in my head.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned spam. My oldest daughter, who is 7, I love this story. She got a hold of my phone one day when it rang and she looked at it. She was going to tell me who was calling me. And she said, "Dad, why does potential spam call you all the time?" I said, "Babe, I don't know. I don't know." So every time the phone rings, she goes, "Dad, tell potential spam to call back later." I mean, it's unreal. It's
Yeah,
unreal.
yeah.
So it's so funny. It's really, I think that there's a level from a higher ed perspective where I've heard from a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues, not even necessarily at University of Central Florida, but at a lot of different institutions who are worried about their jobs. Now,
Mhm.
I think you'll appreciate, and I think your listeners will appreciate the historical context of this. So I did my dissertation, my PhD, when we kind of saw a rise in what I would call like pure blended courses. Like we really kind of started to see hybrid classes start to take off a little bit. That was also around the time, not when MOOCs started, but when they started becoming more mainstream.
Mhm.
And my colleagues were having the same conversations then. This is, 10, 11 years ago compared to what they are now, which was, oh, all these massive online open courses are going to put me out of a job. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? So the same thing, honestly, decades ago when we started to see a pure advent of e-learning. I still vividly remember this because I thought it was so cool. But as a graduate student, an early graduate student, one of the first articles I read about e-learning was an article from like the mid 90s
Mhm.
where it was talking about they were giving women in India courses through flip phones. And so literally like you would read these messages, full online courses that were coming to you through a flip phone. And I'm going, wow, that's awesome. This is not a new conversation. I think we go through these periods where we get really nervous collectively as faculty that we're going to be replaced
Mhm.
or that the institution, something's going to happen to the institution, it's going to fold. I'm not ready to say that with AI. Like again, let's have this same conversation in 3 years. I might be saying something different.
Mhm.
But higher ed's pretty resilient. And, even though we're incorporating a lot of the systems that began in the 1800s, it's a pretty resilient institution. And faculty, I think, are pretty resilient. It's a pretty resilient career.
Mhm.
So I think that part of what we need to do is think about how do we emphasize our humanity in the midst of this. And I
Mhm.
hate soft skills. Like I hate that term. I like human skills to think
Yep.
about a communication. But I don't think teachers are going to go out of style. I
Right.
really don't. And
Right.
I've never felt nervous about that because there are so many things that go into good teaching other than just information transfer.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot about communication as one of the durable skills, one of the new economy skills. I've heard them also called power skills. They got a lot of
Our
names,
skills. Yep.
but
Yep.
they are places where humans tend to outperform versus the bots. Although that's part of why the generative AIs are scary in some ways because they're actually competing with us in places that maybe we didn't expect to see as much competition. But I'd love to hear a little more from you around where else instructional communication might make sense and where else maybe more communication training would be useful. As a parent of just one 5-year old, I am thinking about how if more communication and more media literacy and
Yeah.
more like AI literacy, tech literacy, if all those things were built more into our early curriculum, I think it would really set us up for more success and set our young learners up to be able to succeed in a very complex and changing world that they're going to be working in.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on broader applications of some of the stuff that you research and ways to kind of get the message out so that the right people hear about it?
Yeah, I think that one of the key, you used a lot of key words there. I think one of the key words that you said was literacy. And, it's really interesting. The USA Today, stalwart publication, still written at an eighth grade reading level. And so the reality is that as you're communicating to the masses,
Mhm.
there is still a reality here where simple is better. And we want to make sure that we are not overestimating literacy of our audience. And literacy, not even necessarily in terms of like pure literacy of literally can you read, but literacy in terms of, what do you understand about
Mhm.
all of these other facets of information that are coming to you? It's really, I do some generational differences research too,
Mhm.
that it kind of lends itself to kind of what I talk about and think about. But it's funny, I'm gonna nerd out on you a little bit here again.
Please, you're in a
So
safe place, Michael. No worries.
Save plates. Let's get resumebuilder.com came out with a survey, I think spring of 2023. So a little less than a year ago, where they interviewed, I think, a thousand, maybe 1,200 different managers and asked them what generation is the most difficult generation to work with. Now, this is all cyclical. Like they were saying the same thing about millennials 10 years ago. So it is what it is. But obviously, like 71% of these managers said, these Gen Zers, these young bucks, like, they're terrible. They're terrible. World going to end. The apocalypse that hit Florida during the hurricane's going to hit the whole country. Like, just get ready. That's not necessarily interesting that they said that about Gen Z. What was interesting was one of the reasons why. And across, a lot of different dimensions, 28 or 29% of these managers said part of the reason why Gen Z is a more or the most difficult generation to work with is because they felt like they were not tech savvy, digitally literate. And you're having the same reaction that most people do, which is, well, wait a second, I've been told this is the digital native generation. Like
Yeah.
they've grown up with tech.
TikTok.
Well,
Yeah.
TikTok. Oh my goodness. I have LinkedIn. That's all I have. I can't do. Mama ain't got time for all these other things. I can't do it. I don't. I'm on LinkedIn reluctantly. All of this other stuff. I'm like, man, I can't do it.
You have 5 kids. No excuses needed. You need a sensory deprivation tag. You don't need more social media.
Every time I watch Stranger Things, I go, you know what I would love is for someone to put me in a pool of water with a blindfold and shut the lights and leave the room and just let me be for an hour. I'm cool with that, man. That's intervention I can get behind. I'm fine with it. But it's interesting that we look at Generation Z and we say, oh yeah, they know what they're doing. And when they enter an organization will say, okay, well you're young, therefore we're gonna hand over our social media for you.
Right.
Having TikTok does not equate to being able to use a software in an organization that they've been using with very specific processes and procedures for the last
Yeah.
15 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So all of these companies are going, you told us this generation was tech literate. Well, they're coming in and they don't know what's going on.
Right.
And they can't adopt to, the tools that we're using and the processes that we're using when it comes to these different tools. So I think big picture, it's really interesting that we want to increase a tech literacy and a media literacy and all of these different literacies because we want our audiences to be able to know what is right, what is true, what is real, and I
Mhm.
think to be able to be adaptable. And the reality is that I think that literacy element across the spectrum will be the next key learning outcome that we need to think about. So it's two phases of literacy. Like literally, can you read? Are you literate?
Right.
But then as you look at all of these different realities around you, how are you able to funnel through all of these different pockets of information that are coming at you
Mhm.
and being able to be renaissance enough to adapt to all of these different platforms and realities that are at your disposal?
Mhm.
So I like to cite that resumebuilder.com survey because it's a really interesting tell in
Mhm.
terms of organizations are thinking about this younger generation to where they're going, you promised us a bill of goods and they're coming in and we have to retrain them how to use all this tech. Well, I thought you said they were good at tech. Well,
Right.
there's different layers of that, like different levels.
Yeah, yeah. And at the same time, there's a crisis of trust that they're growing up in. So I do understand why, like, feeling like an institution or, I'm 90s generation Gen X, for me, getting a job was selling
Punk
out,
rock, power on.
exactly. But, like, that's still the truth that's out there. And I think the institutions, these media platforms, the politics, there's a lot of places where it's easy to say, why bother? It's easy to
Yeah,
say, I just don't really want to engage. We're coming up on time here, Michael. Like I always try to find rays of hope amidst what's complicated out there. And,
yeah,
there's a lot for us to learn. There's a lot of places where I think people could ramp up better on being able to critically engage with what's out there. There's also places where the tools you were describing before, that eighth grade level USA Today, could
yeah,
also be the same article could be translated to fifth grade level using
always.
Chat GPT or using something else out there. So
Yeah.
there are some emerging upsides, even though all this stuff needs to be engaged with some criticality and some trepidation. But as we're wrapping up here, any final thoughts, any other comments or ideas you want to get out there for our listeners?
Yeah, I think going back to what I said is I genuinely hope we are moving towards a collective deep breath with all of these things. I kind of mentioned my home in terms of feeling like a sense of urgency and my job in terms of feeling like a sense of urgency. I think it's easy to allow that sense of urgency to paralyze us.
Mm,
And as you mentioned, like we're along for the ride. Let's figure it out as we go. Like we don't have to figure out all of this stuff right now. We're okay. We're okay. Let's take a deep breath.
mm,
Let's figure out in the midst, especially of all this teaching and learning stuff. Like we don't have to just adopt because it's new, but we have to think about always being adaptable and flexible. And from an instructional comm standpoint, always thinking about as a faculty member, if I truly want to, think about having a lasting influence and, really reaching my students, what are those different things that I can do to increase rapport
mm,
and credibility and relationship building
mm.
and increase clarity of message? Like those are good things to think about. So that's probably the biggest thing I can think of here is just a summary of some different things that we talked about. We have a tendency to allow the urgent to press us down so much. And I think we're okay. I think we're okay. And I think it's a really exciting time in higher ed, but I also think it's a little bit of a scary time because it's new and it's different. We're pretty resilient collectively.
Yeah, it does remind me. I've been flying a bunch over the last couple of weeks, and it is that idea of you put your own oxygen mask on first, and it does seem like our teachers, our instructors, higher ed folks deserve some time for a little bit of self care so that they're in a better place. And then if you want to build that rapport, you kind of have to have yourself correct
You do.
first, and that's where thinking about the whole teacher, thinking about really caring for everyone, including the frontline workers who are the folks in our classrooms. Really important notes for us to remember as we head into 2024.
You are not your job. You aren't. And a really good illustration of this guy was at the gym this morning, and one of my PhD students was also at the gym, and he goes, "You come here?" And I said, "Yeah, usually 3 to 4 times a week." And he went, "Well, I didn't know my faculty members like did anything other than faculty." And I thought, "Oh no, what are we doing? Like, what are we? This is the next generation of faculty." Like, yeah, man, I got
Yeah,
kids, got a life,
yeah,
like
yeah,
I have friends, I work out, I eat pizza. Like, I don't know, I'm a real person, and it's you are not your job. Like,
yeah.
it's facet of who you are, and
Mm,
so it's not the sole reality of who you are. So
mhm.
I think that's a healthy perspective to have for any position, but especially as a university faculty member.
Fantastic stuff with Michael Strawser, Associate Professor of Communication at University of Central Florida. Thanks so much for joining me on today's show, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, tell your friends, write us a review, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.